Hello, my name is Rachel Fireman. I'm a senior at the University of Vermont, and I'm interested in pursuing a career in public health. I spent the summer interning for a public health firm named JSI, headquartered in Boston, and was able to work on very interesting projects such as revolutionizing maternal health in Georgia and road mapping for supply delivery chains in Tanzania. The title of this book is Mortal Sins, Sex, Crime in the Era of the Catholic Scandal by Michael D'Antonio. This book focuses on the sexual crimes committed by authority members of the Catholic Church against minors and acts of many other priests, cardinals, and so on to cover up these crimes as sins that could be forgiven and kept private. The book also outlines the oppositions attorneys and victims alike met attempting to broadcast and receive compensation for the atrocities committed by these predators and those that protected them. In this presentation, I will outline the main parts of the novel, as well as establish a thesis and attach my personal feelings regarding D'Antonio's work. D'Antonio opens describing ways in which Catholicism is run. With a strict hierarchy riddled with secrets, the Church acted as a spiritual and cultural guide alike, and required its followers to maintain a regimented and often restrictive lifestyle. After establishing the frame of the Church and how this structure contributes to controversy and scandal, D'Antonio segues into sexual abuse within the Catholic Church with Father Gilbert Goth. A victim of Goth was a pioneer in coming forward and speaking against the atrocities committed and covered up by clergymen. The Gastels stepped forward, outlining how Goth had assaulted their son and used threats to keep them quiet. Father Doyle was outraged by the accusations facing Goth, and reached out to his superiors for answers and to express his concern as to what this meant for the Church. Respondents were short and seemed more concerned with the abusing priest than his countless victims. Doyle uncovered, quote, that in the past, priests and bishops with sexual problems were routinely diagnosed with depression, alcoholism, or some other less stigmatizing problem, end quote. Doyle came to the disappointing conclusion that a priest was able to get away with a lot more than lay people due to their unrelenting protectors provided by the institution itself. D'Antonio realized that many of these victims remained silent due to their respect for the priesthood and the Catholic Church, confusion as to what this represented with their spirituality as well as their sexuality, and pure organic fear. A major structural problem is that cardinals and priests take oaths to keep the Church out of scandals. Often, D'Antonio found that many men of the Church took this oath above protecting members of their and other parishes. Social scientist, therapist, and once priest Richard Sipe studied sexuality and the many ways it manifested within the sexually abstinent Catholic Church. He believed the Church was using homosexuality as a smokescreen to cover up for the sexually deviant acts committed by many members wearing the collar. The controversy surrounding Goth was focused far too heavily on homosexuality and grazing over the actual crimes of pedophilia he committed. As the community and press continued to dig more deeply into Goth's history, they discovered that 10 years prior to abusing the Gastels' son, his superiors were aware of his unfavorable preferences and the danger he posed towards children. This event was pivotal in understanding the depth to which the Catholic Church underwent to save face amidst controversy. Mountain, Goth's lawyer, worked his defense angle to deflect from his client and shine light on the negligence of his supervisors for continuing to let a dangerous man operate so closely to children. Doyle, Mountain, and Peterson, whom operated treatment facilities for sexual deviant members of the clergy, cross nations by mirroring the efforts of famed addiction programs such as Alcohol Anonymous, came to the conclusion that, quote, it was much easier for a bishop to send an accused priest to another parish, another part of the country, or another part of the world, end quote, than it was to excommunicate them and publicly address their indecencies and compensate for the damage they caused. The canon law system allowed for a unique circumstance in which priests could investigate prohibited behavior, like sexual acts, without being required to remove the priests from their positions. Because of this, many cardinals and bishops were aware of illicit sexual acts that were occurring and recommended treatment or moved the priest to a new parish rather than excommunicating him from the church and preventing further abuse. A 5-year statute of limitations prevented priests from being further prosecuted because many of the abused individuals often took more than 5 years to feel comfortable enough after the severe trauma to come forward. All of this legislators seemingly protected the offenders more than the victims. Doyle began to feel pressure from people of higher positions in the church to cease his exploration of this topic and stop defaming the church. He felt it was his duty to preserve and present the truth, and found himself at a standstill with other church officials. Attorney Jeffrey Anderson continued to find instances of priests abusing a collection of individuals and then forced to attend these isolated therapy sessions that were conducted by individuals on the church payroll that quite clearly had motives to produce results that fancy the church's will. If the abuse persisted too publicly or individuals made too much of a stink, private settlements with confidentiality clauses were drawn up and the priest was moved to a new parish scotch-free. These new parishes and their communities were not aware of the specific reasoning behind the reassignment. Anderson took on a particularly active offender, Father Adamson. In this case, he not only wanted Adamson to take responsibility for what he had done and provide some solace to his victims, but also indicate his supervisors who played a part in allowing him access to such a great and consistent pool of potential victims. Bishop Waters met with Anderson and was vague and used loopholes to dodge responsibility for endangering the children of multiple parishes by continuing to reassign Adamson to them. As D'Antonio wrote, quote, Waters often seemed at a loss to recall exactly what he knew and when he knew it, end quote. Once Waters felt as though the face of the church was at stake and Adamson was no longer protectable, he decided it was time for Adamson to take accountability for his own actions, clearly distinguishing between the institution and the individual representing it. The church seemed more concerned with avoiding a scandal than protecting their congregations. Priests used their statuses and authority to help them commit crimes and then were further protected by the church if their victims reported their abuse. The responses of the church further perpetuated this behavior as members of the parish that had these tendencies began to feel invincible and became bolder. The lawyers and priests and victims that had experienced resistance from the church in accepting any responsibility for the actions of countless individuals representing them led to the use of mass media to generate a public outrage. Individuals began to appear on talk shows and do public interviews. With this defamatory press, the church felt pressure to respond and stifle the story, and the various reports backing it. The church began to offer settlement and compensation sums of up to $1 million in some cases to individuals abused by Catholic priests. What the institution still failed to realize was that instead of stifling the cry by making payments and compromises, they needed to reform the structure. Just like moving a priest to a new parish did nothing, paying off a pained and damaged victim was equally ineffective. When American Cardinal Bernardin was accused of raping Stephen Cook, he adamantly denied the allegations. The news spread fast, and the church found itself amid another, even more controversial legal battle. However, Cook recanted his statement, finding he was unsure himself if what he claims were and what they meant to him. Bernardin pronounced himself the victim here, and the people agreed. This particular case cast doubt on the reliability of every abused person's testimony and breathed life back in the reliability of the church's word. Another priest that abused many boys hundreds of times was Father Koss. Despite having been married and being warned by his ex-wife that he was gay and attracted to little boys, or his brother, who alerted church officials that he molested him as a child, the church still ordained him and gave him access to a pool of young boys protected by the church's armor. In the case against Koss, punitive damages were found to be true beyond a reasonable doubt, and the church was ordered to pay approximately a dozen victims upward of $119 million. The Koss verdict demonstrated a judicial system holding an individual responsible past the statute of limitation, and gave hope to victims nationwide that they still had a chance for justice. Anderson tried those responsible for monitoring and placing a particularly brutal offender, Father O'Grady. For the first time, an American cardinal was at the spotlight of a trial as a witness and forced to address the issues involving his negligence while supervising and placing O'Grady. The jury found the church acted irresponsibly and was partly to blame for the extent of O'Grady's abuse. Anderson won his clients $7.5 million each. John Paul II took a soft stance to the scandals involving sexual exploitation by priests within the Catholic Church. On the scarce occasion he did address it, his primary focus was the Church's image and how it was stained, rather than the well-being or the futures of those harmed. In Ireland, the overwhelming abuse was illustrated by the Ryan Report, which outed, quote, 800 abusers in 200 locales, end quote. The Ryan Report inspired the government to further investigate the Archdiocese of Dublin. This document detailed over 100 priest abusers and that local authorities behind an array of badges aided to cover up and protect these individuals. Unlike the prior pope, Pope Benedict took a more hard-hitting stance on sexual violence. Outraged and disappointed by the actions of these Irish priests, he aligned himself with the victims as he spoke of grave disappointment and needing to repave the way in which some of these institutions were run. Instead of placing all the blame on society and addressing previous stances that were too concerned with the reputation of the church and well-being of its priesthood, he focused on the victims and what could be done to change this pattern. This book is about the devastating effects all-powerful institutions like the Catholic Church, riddled with corruption, can have on unsuspecting youth, and the lengths in which the Church was willing to go to preserve its image, even at the expense of its devout followers. I really enjoyed how the book gave a lot of background and personal details about each character. I felt he more heavily detailed the people persecuting the priests than the priests themselves, that I think creates a bit of an automatic bias against the accused. Learning about the long-term effects victims suffered was interesting and a unique way to really portray the heinousness of these crimes committed and covered up by the Church. Sometimes I felt the author rambled on about unnecessary information, which could have been cut out to make the story more direct and powerful. But generally speaking, I think D'Antonio did a great job mapping sexual abuse conflict within the Catholic Church in the last 50 years by telling the story in a very compelling way.